homophonic translation as a way of satirizing psychoanalysis. In what way are the Oulipo's usage of puns continuous or critical of psychoanalysis? If you want, I can read the poem itself.
Un petit d'un petit, c'est en Oal. Un petit d'un petit, à degré de Fallon. Indolent, I'm going to read it I'm not going to try and think in English. Indolent qui ne cesse, indolent qui ne se m'aime, qu'importe un petit, tout gai de regain.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully we get what's going on.
Not again.
Again. What's
I wonder if it's real. So Mechanical Turk things, but the Story Museum are not what they appear to be. I mean, the Story Museum are more about telling stories than stuff. So if the Story Museum say they've got a contraption that writes words, it might be a trick. It might be a hoax. There's this famous thing from have you come across the Mechanical Turk? That the 18th century automaton called the Mechanical Turk wowed everybody towards the end of the 18th century. And that it turned out that it was just a guy sitting inside it.
I came across this book because I've been sort of researching the appendix, but it seemed like particularly useful because it was about, your research was in both the avant-garde and book parts. And then I suppose I was also thinking a bit about how relevant this sort of seemed to be as a book, because there's kind of quite a lot of discussion about automation and we're all now using ChatGPT. I don't know if you've been doing this, but I've been trying to work out ways to get ChatGPT to do poems with me. And I find it quite hard to get it to do. And usually I did try this one where I got it to do every other word and I would write a word. That was kind of slightly more interesting, but it got obsessed with the word whispering and it kept trying. But there is a sort of exploration, and this is going back to the 60s really, but within the Oulipo that does seem to be interested in this idea of a machine, a literary machine. So I think that there's a lot of reasons why this seems relevant at the moment. I really enjoyed reading your book, The Oulipo and Modern Thought, and it's sort of an attempt to read the Oulipo alongside some of their philosophical contemporaries and explore theoretical elements of the Oulipo. But in order to do this, you often go back into the kind of minutiae of Oulipian proceedings, reading the meeting minutes as a way of exploring how their thought developed. Could you just tell me a little bit about the book and how it came about?
Yeah, I really can. It's an interesting question. Thank you for asking that. I haven't really thought about that before. You said you were going to mention it and sent me back. The book had an incredibly long kind of gestation. It was a PhD project for me. I did a degree in English and then I got a job in an office and I was an office administrator until my late 20s. And then I thought, oh God, I can't see myself doing this, forever. I was about 29 and I was really into novels by Georges Perec and a chap called Harry Matthews and Italo Calvino. And somebody had said to me, they were all mates and they were all part of this funny society in Paris. And it blew my mind. Oh gosh, these things that I like have this sort of background thing. And so I discovered the Oulipo. It was 20 years ago, so before the internet was very good. And it made me think, you know what, I'd like to do more of it. I'd like to spend time getting to know this deeply. And so I thought, well, this will be a PhD project. But I was such an idiot. I was long out of academia and I didn't know really what a PhD was or how you did it. And so I was just thinking about it the other day. I took the day off work and went into UCL where I work now. And I knocked on the door of this guy called Mark Ford, who now his office is the office next to mine. Totally bizarre. I had no idea. And so I sent an email to a guy at Birkbeck. Birkbeck still is an incredible university for night school. I couldn't give up my job. I had a kid and so it was going to have to be part-time anyway. Sent an email to Birkbeck. And again, they should have said no, but they were so hard up. I mean, Birkbeck has a sort of history of saying yes to things for the money because that's its situation. So they found me somebody who would supervise this thing. It was totally ill-formed. And so I started doing a PhD on the Oulipo without any idea really about the Oulipo or what a PhD was. And it just said, she said, this was night school. It took 8 years. And during it, I kind of thought, just constant sort of layers of my own anxiety and imposter syndrome. I'm doing a PhD on this French stuff and I can't read French. I need to learn French. I learned French. And then 4 years later, it looked slightly different. And I eventually got the PhD. And then I thought, should I do a book? But my nervousness, my sort of instinctual nervousness, and some slightly out of date advice I got at the time was, no, don't just turn your PhD into a book. Make sure it's a really good book. Maybe this will be the only book you do. So don't just sort of crash your PhD to whichever publisher will take it. And I don't think that's the right advice anymore. Anyway, so I didn't. I thought, oh, what would it be? And then I got these teaching jobs, some bullshit teaching jobs, to keep myself going while I'd sort of completely transformed it and did something else, and was taking these trips to Paris to do God, this is a long, boring answer to your question. It's really, this is an answer that's really all about my own sort of anxieties and you know, embarrassment at doing what you should do, which is, when you've written something, be proud of it, just get it out there. So I didn't do that, and it took me ages. And book came out like 15 years after I started the project. I really like it. I'm pleased with it and proud of it now, but I think I'd have been pleased with it and proud of it 7 years earlier.
Yeah, so I suppose the next question then gets into what is the actual Oulipo.
Yeah, that's a much more straightforward. So the Oulipo, for those who don't know, the Oulipo is a group of writers, but not just writers and scientists. Writers, some mathematicians, some scientists, chess player. Marcel Duchamp was a member, although he never attended. And it was formed in Paris in 1960. And it was formed kind of in response to a feeling that two gentlemen had, and we'll come to who they are in a sec, about what we call the two cultures divide. The idea that scientists and writers don't really know each other, and in the worst cases are proud not to know each other. It's a badge of honor to be, I'm a poet. God, I can't even add up. You know, that kind of an annoyance at literature's deliberate resistance to being scientifically literate, and at the same time a sort of attempt to make scientists interested in literature. So I think that's important to clarify, that over the last 60 years, Oulipo has become more associated with some famous writers, and it feels like a writer's workshop, but it wasn't. It was a meeting place for writers and scientists. I should say OULIPO, and that's an acronym. It stands for the OUvroir de LIttérature POtentielle. So let's say the workroom for potential literature. Well, I'll come to potential literature in a minute, but I say workroom for potential literature, because if you say workshop, then it sounds like we're talking about writers. And the point wasn't that they were writers. They were people who were interested. The idea was to talk about, how could you incorporate ideas from science or ideas from mathematics into the production of literature? The idea wasn't to say, I've got this book I'm working on, maybe I can workshop it with you. That's not that. Maybe it has become a bit like that, but that wasn't the idea initially. The idea was, imagine you're a laboratory trying to come up with new literary approaches that other people would use. You know, if you're in a plastics laboratory and you design a new type of latex, it's not because you need the latex, it's because other people might want to use it. They're a literary laboratory. And that some of the ways that they initially took the ideas of science, mathematics, well, let's have a think. One of them, a chap called Georges Perec, famously thought about exclusion, thought about, well, what if we say, I'm going to write a novel that doesn't have the letter E. So who writes a novel that doesn't have the letter E? That doesn't sound very mathematical, actually. Okay, what about if we say, I'm going to take a poem, an existing poem, and I'm going to say, for every noun in that poem, I'm going to get a dictionary, look up the word in the dictionary, then go 7 nouns further in the dictionary and substitute one out with the other. Then I have a new poem that looks different, means something else. Syntactically, it'll probably still work. I've just swapped a noun for another noun, but I've done a little bit of counting. It all sounds slightly bonkers. It wasn't particularly meant to be. It's playful a bit, but it's thinking about the rules that govern literature. There's an idea that the Oulipo would say was a mistaken idea since the early 19th century, a romantic idea about what literature is, how literature is produced. And Wordsworth says it's the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion recollected in tranquility. So you can't control it. You just feel this powerful emotion and then blah, blah, blah. And what comes with that is an idea of genius. Well, the poet is a genius. He feels things. So he's a poet. You're born a poet. And Queneau, for reasons that we'll probably come to later, thought, I don't really believe in that. I don't really believe in genius. What I believe in is industry. What I believe in is finding out what are the techniques that writers use. And Queneau says, one of the founders of this group, says that that's the way that it's always been. If you look at any literature until the turn of the 20th century, it's a load of rules and how well you perform those rules. A sonnet has 14 lines. It goes de-dum, 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 and it does that 14 times. Aristotle says that a play should have dramatic unities. It should take place in the same time. It should take place in the same place. Plays traditionally have 5 acts or 3 acts. These are all rules that the artist learns, and the artist learns how to perform within a set of rules. The idea of free verse is a relatively new thing. Now, what if we invent some new rules? Those rules aren't fixed. Maybe we can just come up with other rules that also produce great literature, like the sonnets or like the rhyming couplets of Chaucer or whatever. So it's less out there. It's less wacky. What about a rule about only using certain letters is not as sort of crazy as it seems. It's this kind of resistance to the idea that art is playing without rules. It's a little bit puckish. It's a little bit provocative. No, actually, art is really all about how well you can perform within the rules. Why don't we have even more rules? But I think it's not quite as out there as it seems. Now so it's a workroom for literature. What do I mean potential literature? What do they mean potential literature? Well, there was a project that a chap called Raymond Queneau, my great hero, a French writer called Raymond Queneau, was working on in 1960 when the group were founded. And it's about cutting up a book, and it has a relationship with computing and machines that we'll come to. But he says, if I write a sonnet and then I put another sonnet behind it, maybe another sonnet behind that, and I cut between each line. Do you remember those children's books of heads, bodies, and legs? I've got the head of a ballet dancer, the body of a wrestler, and the legs of a deep sea diver. I can flip that and blah, blah, blah. You know, you can mix and match. Why don't I do that with a poem? Now, the good thing about a sonnet is that the rhyming word will always sort of work at the end, as long as I can find 10 rhymes. Yeah, but coming up with rules for creation. But with this, Queneau says, okay, well, I'm going to write a poem that will have, I'm going to write 10 poems. They're all going to be sonnets. The rhyme at the end is always going to be the same. And then I'm going to cut between the pages. And then you can have, tell you the answer, it's 10 to the power of 14. It's 100,000 billion poems. And Queneau will say, I haven't read them all. I don't even know what they all are. And he says in the introduction, if you read one sonnet a minute, 24/7, it would take you like 1.3 million years or something to read every poem in this book. But what I've given you is a machine for the creation of poetry. You choose at random, you flip, blah, blah. It will always work as a sonnet. It will always conform to the rules of a sonnet. It will always be syntactically okay. The rhyme words will always work. But I am divesting my authority as the author. This isn't my spontaneous overflow. I've just created a machine for producing sonnets. There's potential literature in this. So what they're doing is thinking about, what if we create new rules for other people potentially to go off and use? Maybe these will be good, like rhyming couplets or 3-act plays or limericks or something. Maybe some of them won't, but it's quite interesting. I mean, it might be instructive if we have some paper to spend a couple of minutes trying to write without the letter E and see what it does. Maybe we should do that in a sec. Maybe we should. I'm just going to say something else just about forms. So it's really a workshop for thinking about literary forms. And something that emerges pretty quickly is that different forms are suitable for different types of thought. That a limerick, there once was a woman from Hove who fell in love with Michael Gove, or whatever it is, that snappy diddle 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 is great for a certain type of thought. Now, if you're Hegel or if you're Derrida, there's a reason you don't write in limericks, because your thought is doesn't quite fit into that. But the sonnet is slightly longer. The sonnet is so what I'm trying to say is that there's something we probably can all agree with, which is that different forms, the essay is great for a certain thing. The 10,000 word PhD chapter is excellent for a certain size, weight of thought, development of thought. Short story is good for doing something that a novel is good for doing something else. So the idea of thinking, okay, what if we invent new forms? What types of thought will sit in new forms that we invent is not as whimsical or as crazy as it might sound. That the idea of, well, there's potential literature here. We're just trying to slightly jokingly, slightly puckishly push the bracket in terms of new forms. What are they good for? What will they help us? What thoughts will they help us to contain? Shall we do it? Shall I have a quick Oblique strategies. Right, exactly. Yeah. You'll say a bit about this in a sec. Excellent. Right. Now, haiku is a brilliant form for expressing a certain type of thing, usually to do with meditation on nature. A very, very, we don't have movement of time in a haiku and stuff, but it would be a terrible form for something more drier and more intellectual.
Are we just writing something without any ease? Is this?
Yeah, whatever comes into your head.
Most costs been sadly, badly, madly out of control, biting the author on his wrist, spitting in his hair, spoiling his ponytail, and spiralling out of the pub door on the back of a gloomy snail bound to Norfolk.
That's immense. That's amazing. Wow. Where did that come from? Is that something that's on your mind at the moment? Well, yeah, you say no, but I wonder if I'm inclined to disagree, whether what this does is produces sort of risings up of what's secretly on our mind. And I'm going to pick on you. What have you got? It's really hard. Yeah.
What kind of stupid thoughts stick out of my dumb brain in such a situation? Sitting, writing, thinking without anything in mind, no path in sight, no sign of victory, only loss.
Very, very good. Like Paul and like me, this is a kind of like, what do? I narrate my thing. So this is the thing that I fall into writing first. How to say writing is my own. Oh God, this is running into brick. So that, yeah, totally unlike these two here. I think there's sort of two paths that this exercise can go down. But it's an interesting exercise in terms of thinking about, well, if we invent a new form, I can't remember what they call it, a lipogram, writing where certain letters are prescribed, what type of thought sits well within that, or what's the point of that? And in some cases, certain people in the Oulipo would say, well, it's quite good because it leads you into saying the things that you want to say but aren't allowed to say. This is what I thought with yours, that there's something on your mind, a sort of taboo thing that you didn't realize was on your mind, but it sort of bobbed up. It presented very good, yeah, that it's not entirely surrealist poetry. Whereas here, I find it really interesting that you're not even quite sure what that was.
Okay, I swim slowly in a milk soup and drink fast much of it. What is a girl to do? To say I wasn't thirsty or hungry.
It's very nice, thank you. I'm surprised because as the sort of lettriste poet, you could have just gone, if somebody says you're not allowed to use the letter E, you could fall into sort of Isu mode and just do...
How hard to resist the B sound sort of table.
Yeah, that's true. Just something to say about Peric's novel. So Peric wrote this novel without the letter E, and it's called La Disparition. And in English, there's an excellent, superb translation called Avoid of this novel without the letter E. So if you want to read it in English, I thoroughly recommend it. But the point is that E is the most common letter. It's the hardest thing to avoid. So the Spanish translator wrote it without using the letter A, and the Russian translator wrote it without using the O sound, and the Japanese translator wrote it without using the I sound. So the point is there's nothing special about the letter E. Really, the constraint is, how can I do the hardest thing in writing? And there's a sort of sad backstory to it, which is that Peric's mother was killed in the Holocaust. Peric grew up an orphan. His father was a soldier, died in the Battle of France in 1940. His mother died in the camps. And this sort of whimsical thing of writing without the letter E isn't as whimsical as it sounds. It's well, I'm a writer. How can I express formally what my orphanhood was like? What's the hardest thing? The hardest thing for me was to grow up without a mother. What does that look like in writing? Well, the hardest thing for me as a writer is to be a writer without the maternal E. Yeah, so these rules and games have a playfulness, but they're not just playful. They're not just parlor games. They're an attempt to do serious things, but they have a nice wit about them. They have a nice lightness about them. Hang on, this is great. This is the gang, right? Yeah. This is the Oulipo. Oh man, I should have said the main thing about the Oulipo. So they met, they decided to form a gang in 1960, November 1960. Raymond Queneau and his friend François le Lionnais, two chemist and famous writer who have been friends since the war, friends since 1944, decided to have a group where they would talk about combining their interests, getting over this two cultures divide. And the way that they did their group was they met in a restaurant. First they met in a restaurant in Paris called Le Vrai Garçon, and then they would meet at Queneau's house for lunch once a month. So it's convivial. It's once a month and pretty much uninterrupted to this day. The last original member died in 2017, taking on new members, and they meet for lunch once a month. It's very exclusive, Very exclusive. We have a picture of them at one of the lunches in the mid-70s here. One of the rules is that you can't leave. Once you join the Oulipo, there's no way of leaving. And even if you die, you're still officially a member. And the only way that you're allowed to leave the Oulipo is if you commit suicide, and at your suicide, you have a notary who records your signed affidavit that you're only committing suicide in order to leave the Oulipo. And so in this picture, this is a picture of the Oulipo in 1970, and we have a few ghostly figures hovering. These are members who have been in the group and died. And so in the group photo, they've had to doctor the photo in order to make sure that the dead members are not excluded from the photo. It's very important. And this is important. I mean, this goes to the sort of background for the Oulipo. Queneau, who see him, this might be after he's died. He might have to be one of those hovering figures. Sorry, this is stupid. I should be able to point it. But anyway, Queneau, one of the founder members of the Oulipo in the 1920s, was a member of the Surrealists. And the Surrealists was a gang with the absolute opposite ethos. Everyone got kicked out of the Surrealists. Queneau got kicked out of the Surrealists because his girlfriend was a lady called Jeanine Kahn, and Jeanine Kahn's sister had been André Breton's girlfriend. And André Breton broke up with the sister and then said to Queneau, "So you and Jeanine, yeah, I don't like seeing her around." And Queneau said, "But she's my girlfriend." And Breton said, "You're out." And so when Queneau started his own group, the idea, this is a specifically deliberately anti-surrealist policy, is we're not going to have one of those fractious groups where everybody hates each other and you have an autocrat who's constantly ejecting people. We're going to have a group where it's written into the rules that no one can ever kick you out, that that there's a sort of rigid conviviality, if that's not an oxymoron.
For example, Harry Matthews takes Wordsworth's Daffodils and the Standard English-German Dictionary and produces this.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in a never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils.
This is a transformation rule. You take a poem, you find all the nouns, and you look them up and you replace them with the thing. And I was just talking about the Oulipo and Surrealism, that Queneau's sort of lifelong lesson was that he didn't want to be like the Surrealists. And there's a lot to say about why he fell out so badly, partly for personal reasons, partly he was shocked at how fractious and unpleasant the group was. But he also falls out with the Surrealists for intellectual reasons. Maybe I'll say a bit about that in a sec. So we get these Oulipian things that sometimes look like sort of kicks at the Surrealists. Now, the poem that just read out, The Imbeciles, sounds a bit surrealist. If you didn't know, can I just read a bit? Beside the lamp, beneath the bees, fluttering and dancing in the cheese. Right, there's a sort of set of images there that are difficult, that don't fit, that don't make sense. They go, well, that's a bit surrealist. I'm just going to read the way that we talked about automatic writing, is that surrealists would say, well, we're discovering the sort of deep powers of the unconscious here. There's certain methods that we use to bring on automatic writing. One of them is hunger. Breton, here's André Breton in the Surrealist Manifesto. This is 1924. This is Breton talking about how to bring up surrealist material. After you've settled yourself in a place as favorable as possible to the concentration of your mind upon itself, have writing materials brought to you. Okay. Nice. Put yourself in as passive or receptive a state of mind as you can. Forget about your genius. Okay, Breton, your talents and the talents of everyone else, keep reminding yourself that literature is one of the saddest roads that leads to everything. Write quickly without any preconceived subject, fast enough that you'll not remember what you're writing and be tempted to reread what you've written. It's good. I mean, it's actually quite fun to do surrealist automatic writing. But all of this stuff about forget about your genius, literature is the road that leads to the saddest place. Then we hear Raymond Queneau in 1960 on the radio describing S+7. He says in an interview, he says, what happens when you do this? Well, the appearance is surrealist, perhaps, but the method is not, which is quite important. Just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in a dictionary and then change the nouns. That's an automatism. But it's an automatism which has absolutely nothing to do with what we call surrealist automatic writing. If the result is surrealist, or at least seemingly surrealist, then this is simply an appearance. They have nothing to do with each other. Now, Breton also goes on to say, sometimes it's important to starve yourself. You need to do all this bullshit to do surrealist writing. And Queneau here is saying, well, how about you just count to 7? I can give you a surrealist poem. I can give you a machine to write a surrealist poem. You just need a dictionary and the ability to count to 7 on your fingers. And so this is a kind of what we get a lot with the Oulipo is an engagement with surrealism, a frustration with surrealism, a kind of saying, look, these surrealists, you're still fucking romantic bullshitters. Really, creating art is about learning the rules, is about hard work, is about coming up with rules, about industry. Sometimes Queneau talks about the surrealists as, he says, they just plunge into their unconscious and they think that that's going to produce interesting art, but really they're not. But one of the things that we get with Oulipo and with these Oulipian techniques, I think hovering in the background is a kind of engagement or resistant engagement with surrealism, a frustration with surrealism that's a result of Queneau's early days. 30 years later, he's still thinking, those idiots, they think they're bringing up the deep taboo secrets of the unconscious. When we did that exercise with writing out the letter E, it was interesting what happened over here looked surrealist, right? Looked like automatic writing, whereas we were doing a slightly more uptight, resistant thing about how can I just, and you, I think, were saying something that you had on your mind. But all sorts of different things are happening. And I think different periods of the Oulipo feel differently about this, that the Queneau's 1960s, I'm basically against surrealists. I'm coming up with techniques that are sort of coded attacks on the ethos of surrealism, starts to wane a little bit. But yes, that's what S+7 I think is. S+7 is a way of saying, look, you want a surrealist poem, get a dictionary, count to 7, go and get some Verlaine, and I'll show you a surrealist poem. And it's that easy. Don't starve yourself. Don't worry about your genius.
I don't remember the full details, but I learned this when I was in my MA in fine art, and so the ones that I remember where I've learned something new. But it was Brian Eno in the 70s, and they came up with oblique strategies with someone else whose name I've forgotten, like Answer Freud. And it was oblique strategy. So it's like you bring flashcards out. And for me, it was flashcard coming out saying, use a material in a way it shouldn't be used or something. So I made a half flower, half egg made out of plasticine and paper and cocktail sticks. So something like that, which is just kind of making you like think outside the box and break the rules by having these new rules that break the rules.
Right. Yeah. So the idea here is that when we're trying to be creative, we fall into ruts, we fall into patterns, we end up being frustrated with ourselves because our creativity is not that creative. And by imposing rules, by picking an arbitrary rule from a box, and Eno would do this with artists that he was producing as well. He would say, okay, that music's fine, but why don't you use a material in it? And so in order to just throw people in, which is a bit like, there's that thing you want to write, now try writing it without the letter E. It's not as terrible an idea as it sounds.
Is it maybe true that it's impossible for anything really, really, really to be random? And so the Oulipas are just acknowledging that a bit more than the surrealists.
That's an interesting idea. I think that mathematicians say that it's impossible for anything to be really, really random, and they mean something slightly different. But what we're doing, I suppose, is I think a later member of the Oulipo, somebody like Calvino or Perec, would say, okay, but there's nothing much more random than your individual id. When you do this thing, now that's not random because I'm accusing you of having this thought on your mind. That's not random because you were thinking that. You didn't know you wanted to say it, but actually you did want to say it. That's not random. That is an expression of yourself. So yes, in a way, but the trouble, we're blocking ourselves. We have our taboos. We have our resistances to the things that we deeply want to express. And it's by sort of oblique strategies that these things that, exactly as you say, aren't random. They're actually the least random thing in the room, which is the thing that I'm really thinking about. But the thing that I'm really thinking about is also the thing that I don't want anyone to know I'm thinking about. So is that not, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I think that's how some of the Oulipo think about that you need strategies for distracting your own repressive mechanisms. You throw your repressive mechanisms a bone, and while it's off there searching that, suddenly I said the thing that I didn't want you to hear, or I expressed the thing that I really wanted to express, but I was having trouble expressing.
In the first chapter of your book, you compare Umberto Eco's analysis of James Bond, which attempts to find an underlying structure to James Bond novels, with Lionnais' Oulipian account of murder mysteries. How did these ideas around sort of cybernetics, literature machines, and internal structures sort of influence the ideas of the Oulipo?
Great. Well, thank you for that. So I think it's a tricky question, and if I ramble a bit, then do forgive me. So we've got a few things going on here. We've got Oulipo, we've got cybernetics, and we've got structuralism, which is a sort of philosophical, critical movement particularly in Paris, but that becomes a sort of widespread in academia in the 60s. I should probably say a little bit about what all of those are. Cybernetics, we probably know. Cybernetics is the use of, or the idea of thinking computers that can do sort of human tasks. And after the Second World War, this is a real growth industry. We cracked the Enigma code using essentially cybernetics. There's a gentleman who's on the £50 note, Alan Turing, sort of found a sort of movement of computer science in the late 40s, and has this famous kind of gnomic statement about computers and human tasks, which I've forgotten now. What did he say? He said something along the lines of, paraphrasing badly, but if computers could read sonnets, if computers wrote sonnets, maybe it would take a computer to understand it. So we're thinking suddenly, this is 1949, and we're starting to think about, gosh, computers can do brilliant things. Computers can crack the codes. Computers can win us the war. Could they do the tasks that we think of essentially human, like writing? In the early 50s, we see computers the size of a room at Manchester University and in Paris doing these things that look like writing. So early cybernetics in the 1950s. And it really has a load of money thrown at it by the governments of the day and by the CIA. And in Paris, there's a cybernetic workshop, a cybernetic seminar set up to get the people at the forefront of computing to speak to people at the forefront of the humanities. So there's a monthly workshop where people like a chap called Claude Lévi-Strauss, an anthropologist called Lévi-Strauss, a psychoanalyst called Jacques Lacan are coming and talking to mathematicians about, okay, well, what computers do? What is this cybernetics? And they go away and they start thinking about, actually, my subject might be much more structured. What if I had to explain this to a computer? Maybe I could explain my subject, whether it's anthropology or psychoanalysis. And you find in writing about Lacan writing about psychoanalysis in the 50s, or Lévi-Strauss writing about anthropology in the 50s, ideas from computer science making their way into these disciplines. And this comes to be known as structuralism. The idea that, okay, I break down the famous example is phonology. Phonology is the science of what are all the sounds that we can make with our mouths? What are all the sounds that we use in speech? It turns out, if you really analyze the way that you make these sounds, that me going P, is very similar to me going B, and the only difference, my lips are the same. The only difference is whether my voice box is on or off. Nothing changes here. It's just that. And the same with and we find that actually you can break down the sounds that we make into, a sort of grid of well, is it with your teeth or is it with your lips? Is it at the front of your mouth, the back of your mouth? Is your voice box on or off? And then it turns out that there are certain sounds that we don't use, but we could. We know they're there because on a grid you can go, okay, well, we don't make a noise in English, but I could. And maybe its existence is sort of shown up by the fact that, it's only whether or not you do it at the front or the back. If you start to put these things into a grid, you can see, actually, there's a thing that exists that we just don't do. And so thinking about phonology, and we start to find the same idea happening in narratology. Well, the idea of how we think about literature. Well, maybe a story can be analysed into what are the elements of, actually, if you look at genre fiction, if you look at a James Bond story, it always goes, it starts off with the villain meeting James Bond. That's A. Then Bond will travel to an exotic location. That's B. Then he'll get a glimpse of a sexy girl. That's C. Then D, the sexy girl will turn out to be a social. So Umberto Eco, the thing you were asking, Umberto Eco, a structuralist analysis of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels, where he says, basically, there's 9 things. There's A to I. It always ends up with Bond winning, the villain's defeated, Bond sleeps with a guy. I can't remember what I is, but basically A, B, C, D, E, all of these elements are always in place. These novels, James Bond novels, are essentially just a shuffling of the same elements. There's a fundamental structure. Sometimes we have multiple Bs. Bond travels to a nice location, then he travels to another nice location, then he sees the sexy girl. But effectively, it's breaking down a genre into its constituent things and saying you never have one of these things that doesn't end up with all of the letters all present and correct. And Oulipo sort of do the same thing. This is Oulipo's funny relationship with structuralism, that Oulipo independently, but I think I'm saying in my book, not really independently, everybody, whether they're friends with each other in Paris or not, is essentially starting to think along the same lines. Actually, what if literature, narrative, not just the stuff we did earlier, thinking about rhymes and letters, what if the larger elements, components of literature, characters, plot, have a finite number of elements that we could examine, break down, look at their structures. And then what does that mean? Then does that mean that actually any story is just a rearrangement of the same things? This is the sort of the mid-60s structuralist idea of, hang on, is our stories basically just a reorganization of certain components? When we analyze literature, should we really just be thinking about what are its components? You know, not what does this novel look like, but what is this novel a configuration of, an iteration of? And Oulipo do that. What do they do it with? They don't do it with James Bond novels. I forgot what I said.
Murder mysteries.
Murder mysteries. Okay, same thing. Basically, it looks very similar, except that it's jokey. The only difference between Oulipo and the structuralists is the structuralists are all working at universities and take themselves very seriously. And Oulipo have this resistance to seriousness. There's something you find, I mean, it's a trope that goes back as far as you like, that writers are constantly kind of saying, I don't really like the academy. Yeah, there's, and it's not really true. They're reading writers are incredibly academically literate, but there's that thing in Waiting for Godot, where Vladimir and Estragon are slagging each other off, insulting each other, and yeah, asshole. Yeah. And the last one, the worst insult is when Estragon goes, critic. And that's it. Really, the critic is, for a writer, the critic is the worst thing you can be. But I think, so Oulipo have this sort of difficult relationship with structuralism where they think, hang on, where's our terrain? What's our idea? We're doing the same thing. They're doing this thing there. Shit, that's what we're doing in our meetings. We're all thinking now in a sort of post-cybernetic era of, oh yeah, I wonder if I had to explain this to a computer, how would I explain it? We find it in their meeting minutes. We find them saying, should we invite them? Yeah, but then, where does that leave us? What's our identity? And the only answer they can come up with is, God, they're all so fucking serious. Our identity is we're doing the same thing, but we're less hung up on ourselves.
So I'm going to just leap onto homophonic translation. I got this one from Wikipedia, but it's Dumpty.
Oh, wow.
So it's just, I'll just read the first line, but they translate Humpty Dumpty as petit dum petit. So I just think that's quite a fun homophonic translation. So basically, homophonic translation is translation based not on the meaning of the words, but on the way they sound. In your book, you look at the Oulipo's use of homophonic translation as a way of satirizing psychoanalysis. In what way are the Oulipo's usage of puns continuous or critical of psychoanalysis? If you want, I can read the poem itself.
Un petit d'un petit, s'étend aux halles. Un petit d'un petit, à degrés de Fallon. Indolent. I'm going to read it I'm not going to try and think in English. Indolent qui ne cesse, indolent qui ne se même, qu'importe un petit, tout gai de regain.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully we get what's going on. And I say just a little bit about the sort of translation theory behind it, and then we'll talk a bit about psychoanalysis. Clearly what's happening there is you take something, doesn't matter if you use another language or not. We could do the same thing, just staying within English all the time. But if you're translating between languages, usually in any translation, we say that there's the translation invariant. So usually when you're translating, there's one thing that doesn't vary, and that's the meaning. So you try to get the sense of it, the rhythm of it as close as possible, but it's the one thing you have to stay faithful to, that's the meaning. And Oulipo say, well, hang on, what about if we change that priority? What if we say, okay, well, no, the thing that we have to be faithful to is the sound. Okay, we're not allowed to, so meaning can change, blah, blah, blah. This actually isn't that unusual. So say you're certain poetic translation, if you're translating Dante has a very particular meter and rhyme scheme in the Italian, and some translators say, well, hang on, that's the main thing. We need to know how Dante sounds. And if I translate it and I have to go a little bit further away from the meaning in order to keep the terza rima, then that's worth it. So sometimes if you're translating poetry, you think, hang on, the fact that it's poetry is the thing that I need to keep. And Oulipo is saying, okay, we're not the first people to do this, but let's say the thing that we need to keep, the primary invariant, is the syllables, the sound of them. And then it can mean something completely. That you put a pretty good translation up next to it.
A child of a child is surprised at the market. A child of a child, oh, degrees you needed. Lazy is he who never goes out. Lazy is he who is not led. Who cares about a little one? All happy with raisonnés.
So we've gone miles away. We've got nothing to do with the meaning of the original. But what we've done is preserve in the sense there's all sorts of other things you can do there. You can say, okay, well, the primary invariant is the number of letters in each word. So Humpty Dumpty, all I need to do is 2 words that are 5 letters each. So grand, baton, 8, and oh God, I've buggered it up. But there's all sorts of things that we could say, okay, I'm going to say that this is the most important thing. And we can do sort of exercises with that. This is when we were talking at the beginning about sound poetry, whether Oulipo do sound poetry. This is what I'm thinking. It's not quite the same as sort of Dadaist sound poetry, but it's thinking about sound as the key, sound as the thing that we can't get rid of. Now, why have I got a chapter on this and psychoanalysis? Well, a funny thing happens in Freud. So here is Freud and his friend. This is an early essay by Freud called On the Forgetting of Proper Names. You know the way that we always forget proper names? You know the way I think I did it earlier in this. So suddenly you think, oh, there's that person, there's that guy. I mean, what's his name? And you can't remember that. Not only can you not remember the name, but another name keeps coming into your head and you can't see past the word that keeps suggesting itself. Freud noticed this, and Freud says, yeah, I'll give you an example of me doing this, and then I'll tell you why it happens. This is September 1898. Freud is on holiday. He's on holiday on the Adriatic coast. He's sharing a taxi with a guy from Berlin who he's never met before. And they're having a chat and it's going quite well. And Freud tells a dirty joke or a dirty story about the local Bosnians that he's heard from a colleague. And the story goes that the Bosnians hold the medical profession, Freud's a doctor of the medical profession, in such high regard, but they're also characteristically, as a nation, very kind of fatalistic. And he says this combination of fatalism and respect is such that if a doctor should ever report that a patient is untreatably fatally ill, the Bosnian will say, Herr, which is the German word for sir, Herr, what is there to be said? If he could be saved, I know you would help him. So respect for the doctor, but also fatalism. And then he remembers another story about the Bosnians. And he says the same thing. So I've got another story. But the story is a bit rude, which is that the Bosnians are also into sex. They attach a lot of value to sexual pleasure. And same situation, the Bosnian says, Herr, you must know that if that comes to an end, then life is of no value. So if I can't do it anymore, then I don't want to be right. And then later on in their conversation, he told this guy these 2 stories. And then he wants to tell the German lawyer about some paintings in the city of Orvieto. They're by a painter called Signorelli. He can't remember. Orvieto, the paintings by, and he can't remember. And he says the names Botticelli and Boltraffio keep coming into his head. And a couple of years later, he's thinking about this. Why could I not remember the name Signorelli? And listen to this. I'll read this out. This sounds quite strange, but this is what Freud says happened. Looking back on the episode in an early scientific paper, Freud tries to analyze, firstly, why he should have repressed the name of the correct artist. And secondly, by what mechanism, why those other 2 names suggested themselves to him. Here's what he says. What he concluded was a series of puns working across different languages. The artist's name was Signorelli, and this has been broken down, says Freud, into its component syllables. The first part, Signor, if you translate it into German, is Herr. And that term Herr, sir, was also in the story that he told the guy just before. Sir, if I forget Herr, if I can't have sex anymore, Herr, about Bosnians and their sexual proclivities. And moreover, hair is a charged syllable at the time of the conversation, says Freud, because it also occurred at the start of the country that they're in, Herzegovina. Bosnia, similarly, the Bosnia-Herzegovina is similarly loaded. And this is the reason the Bo of Bosnia, says Freud, is why he keeps thinking Botticelli, Boltrafio, and so on. Now, that all sounds a bit mad, but Freud says this punning, this is why certain things you suppress. There was the dirty story that I didn't want to tell you about the Bosnians and how much they like sex. And when I was getting distracted with not saying that dirty story, hair, that was making me forget signorelli, because hair means signor, and the fact that we're in Bosnia-Herzegovina, blah, blah, blah. Now, whatever you think about that, Oulipo, I think, are looking at this type of interpretation, this type of a lot of them are in analysis, and a lot of them are thinking, hang on, this sounds pretty whack. This sounds quite... And the trouble is that there's so many other ways that you could arrive at that conclusion, that there's so many. Every time you have a pun, you have 100 other puns. Hair could mean, if you spoke English, it could mean the hair on your head. Then we've got a trilingual pun. Do you see what I'm saying? That Freud says, I've discovered the secret of why this happens. Here, let me tell you a story. Now, if you look at that and go, I'm not really sure about that. One of the reasons you might be saying I'm not really sure about that is because every pun just leads on to a million other puns. It might be time for another exercise. It might be time for us to do a bit of homophonic translation. I will give you a couple of lines and let's see. We don't have to speak any other language. We're going to do everything from English to English. But, God, the first thing that comes to my mind is Shake It Off by Taylor Swift. I stay out too late. Got nothing in my brain. I stay up too late. Write those down and then see what else you can do that sounds similar, using the same puns but different words. The syllables have to be I stay out too late, and you'll see how this goes. I've never done this before. It might be crap.
I got nothing in my brain.
I stay up too late, got nothing in my brain.
No, it doesn't have to mean anything. No, good question.
Is stay up too late, got no thinking my crane.
Nice. Okay. Hang on, what's the first word?
Is stay up too late, got
too late. Nice.
Too late.
Yeah, excellent.
No thinking my crane.
Very nice. I like it. We'll have a few more. I've got coming down to Brighton. I'm not that familiar with Brighton, but I believe there is a place called the Lanes. I see at the Lanes gonorrhea, and then I fall into America. I'm a break. I don't know what it means. I see at the Lanes gonorrhea. I'm a break. What have you got?
Got ice stay up to 8. But you had 2 and 8.
Very good, yeah.
Follow a very similar route. I stay 2 8. God, no finger ring my grave.
No. Oh, wow. Good.
I stay 2 8. God, no finger ring my grave.
I like it very much. But I think what we're starting to see is if we're Freud and we think that there's one version of this, then we're mad, because you ask 7 people this and you get 7 different things. And this is what Oulipo do. Oulipo do these kind of feeding frenzies of let's take one series of syllables. They take the name of the opera soprano, Montserrat Caballé, and they say, okay, well, imagine what Montserrat Caballé can be. That can all sorts of things that will be punchlines to stories. So imagine you've got two crustaceans and happily chatting with each other. Then they realize that they're in kitchen and they realize that they're going to be cooked, and they don't want to swear. So instead of saying merde, they just say mère Montserrat Caballé. So Montserrat Caballé. So shit, we're going to be garlicked crabs. Or there is a Tintin story where Red Rackham, the pirate, has a mistress, and he's always wanted to discuss. This isn't me, this is the Oulipo. He's always wanted to do anal with her, and she's always resisted. And then one day she decides, fuck it. And so she goes, can't remember what the first word is, but it's Rackham by, yeah. She's English. So yeah, Rackham, yeah. So, and they have 100 of these. That if you take that series of syllables, Montserrat Caballé, forget Freud, forget, oh yes, and of course the signorelli, and that was because we were in Bosnia. No, actually what's going on here is there's a million puns, that any pun gives gap. So we have these sort of ways of, doing homophonic translation as a sort of fun thing, but also if you look a bit more deeply into the way that the Oulipo are talking about it when they're talking about their analysis, they're also sort of saying, well, analysis is good, it can cure your toothache or something, but Freud has not discovered the secret of why you forget proper names here. So sorry, that's Long answer to why Oulipo and homophonic translation is part of a sort of playful talking about, but critiquing some of the authority that we give to psychoanalysis.
What I might do is I'm going to sort of mention the next question, and if you want to respond to it, you're welcome to. And but I will read the other question as well, so then we can get two done at once. So the first question was really about the Surrealists and Nicolas Bourbaki. So these were two groups in Paris prior to the Oulipo. And I was sort of, or could you tell us about how they influenced either negatively or positively the work of the Oulipo? And then the other question that I was going to ask really was about the Snowball poem. So I'm going to just move on to the Snowball poem, which is this one here. So the idea behind the Snowball poem is that each time you add an extra letter to each word. So in this one, you get, I am the text, which begins sparingly, assumingly, magnitude, constantly, perceptibly, proportional, incorporating, unquestionable incrementations. Like S+7, which is literary machine, unlike S+7, which might be seen to signal the death of the author because you don't need to contribute anything as an author. The snowball can be used as a means of expression. So you quote Matthews on his encounter with the student who used the snowball to express his frustration with the idiotic procedure. What is the relationship between the Oulipo and the author?
And that's really a key question. What's the relationship between the Oulipo and the author? And the answer is that it changes. The relationship between the Oulipo and the author in 1960 is different from the relationship between the Oulipo and the author by the mid-70s. In 1960, we talked the business I was talking about earlier about the sort of high structuralist moment of thinking about, well, what if we didn't have authors? What if we could explain everything, the structures of literature, the way that characters work, the way that plot works to a machine? What would be the ideal of that? And in structuralism, Roland Barthes ends up producing an essay called The Death of the Author, an essay where he sort of imagines that texts don't need authors, that texts exist and texts are not simply a communication between a human being and us as the reader, which is a kind of structuralist ideal. Well, maybe we can evacuate the idea of an author from a text. Maybe we can get a machine to write a text and then we don't need authors. And Oulipo in 1960 are thinking this as well. But by the mid-70s, no one is thinking that anymore. The structuralist moment has sort of moved on, and it's the same in the Oulipo. And we get a kind of return to essentially romanticism, essentially to this thing that the Oulipo always say that they reject. When they're arguing with Surrealism, Oulipo always say, the romantic surrealists. By the mid-70s, secretly, everybody has welcomed back that idea of, what if I'm actually expressing myself in a way? We keep coming back to you. I'm sorry about this, but when we did our first excerpt, we were writing without the letter E. What if that was me? What if that was my personal thoughts? A computer couldn't write that because a computer wasn't thinking that. So there's what's the relationship with the author of the Oulipo? Well, in the mid-70s, they're starting to think, well, actually, maybe some of our techniques, like the snowball or like writing without the letter E, are ways of inducing the real author, inducing the author to say repressed or taboo things. Not that there isn't such thing as a real author, not that we could just count to 7 and we have a text. So we see a slight difference between S+7. Do you remember you take a poem by Wordsworth, you count to 7, and you've got another poem. There's no human agency in that. You've got an algorithm, you feed in those values, you get out those values. Brilliant. We've totally evacuated the idea of a human being need to do. I've got a poem here about the imbeciles. I did nothing. Here's a text that doesn't have an author. Brilliant. A literature machine. This, though, or writing without the letter E, or trying to do homophonic translation, isn't a literature machine. It requires us to do something. It requires we were talking about randomness earlier, something that's maybe random is not quite the word, but something that is human, organic. In order to write a text like this, we could all have a go, but we'd all come up with different things, and we could then argue about whether those things are deep psychoanalytical expressions of ourselves or not. But what they aren't is procedures, processed texts. There is an author every time you do this, or every time you write without the letter E, there is you in it. So that's, I think, two very different moments in the Oulipo. There's an early Oulipo 1960, which is a sort of structuralist Oulipo, and there is a later version, which, like everybody, sort of we sort of realize, actually, maybe we all feel differently after last November and ChatGPT, but I think that the sort of high structuralist moment of the death of the author wasn't really sustainable, and we find everybody slightly sort of yielding a little bit and going, actually, I do have something to say, and that happens in the Oulipo as well. Some of these things feel like the constraint is everything, but it turns out no, actually, even the way that we've filled in the gap the way that we've wrestled our path through the constraint, then suddenly has quite a lot of valency, like in terms of where are we in this text? It's a really good question. What's the Oulipo's relationship with the author? And I really think, well, tell me when you're talking about, and we've got two different answers.
So I think this sort of leads on to the next question. I'm going to read two questions at a time because we're running out of time. But I think these two questions read well together anyway. So your exploration of the relationship between the authorial voice and the literature machine in Oulipian writing is developed further in a chapter on combinatoric circles and the Kleinemann. So that this is, I don't know how you pronounce this name, but is it Lull?
Oh, yeah, Raymond Lull, a medieval theologian.
Have you got Detritus? Yeah, I've got this. So you can see the circles at least.
Yeah, I should say something about these circles. These are medieval books, and Lull is a theologian. It's encouraging us to think about God. The book's actually not this one, but another very similar diagram has what we call a volvelle, a turning circle on the page. So you have your circle with all your writing around it, and then pinned into the page, pinned into it so you can spin it, you have a wheel. And Lull says, okay, when we're thinking about the nature of God, we have God's goodness, bonitas bonum, we have his greatness, we have his everlastingness. Now, what about his great everlastingness? What about his good largeness? And so he encourages us to go through all of the combinations of taking one of these words adjectively and one of them as a noun. That allows us to, like a structuralist, these are, now I've said everything there is to say about God. If I turn this wheel, God has, 9 characteristics there I can't see. And each of those characteristics could be an adjective or a noun. His good largeness, his everlasting greatness, his great everlastingness, blah, blah, blah. Each of those, if I'm meditating on the nature of God, is slightly different. How do I know that I've totally thought about God? I'll move the wheel around. How do I know what I want to meditate on today? I'll move the wheel around. So these are moving books, a bit like Queneau with the sort of cut up poems. Here are the, 9 to the power of 2 characteristics.
When I read this, I was thinking about some of your other work. So you have written on the index, for example.
Yeah.
And for me, this had some sort of parallel.
And I suppose, but mostly I teach English literature. I teach undergraduates about Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot and stuff. But what I really like to think about is books as machines, books as physical objects. They're made of paper. When did paper reach Western Europe? Well, the first paper mill in England was 1495. What did the printing press do? Change to literature, about literature, really thinking about the history of the materiality of books. And I often think, well, that's funny, a funny place to end up after writing a thing on the French avant-garde. But I think actually maybe it's not, because I talked earlier about Queneau thinking about the book as a machine. How could you make a book as a machine for generating 10 to the power of 14 poems? Well, if I cut the paper in 9 incisions there or whatever it is, then suddenly I've changed, my book looks different. It's got cuts in it, and I've turned it into a machine for creating. Oh, that's interesting. What about the relationship between Lull and structuralism? Well, Lull is thinking about, well, if I add a rotating wheel to my manuscript, then my book's turned into a machine again. Well, not again. No, he's the guy who did it. And the index is a bit like that. I wrote a book about the history of book indexes. And again, I'm thinking about when we think about reading, very often we make the mistake of thinking about novel reading, which is just a tiny fraction of the reading that we do. You walk down the street and you read posters and street signs and writing on the pavement. You come here, I just read a menu. What beer have you got? Blah, blah. We're constantly reading, and novels are just the absolute tip of the, less than 0.1% of the reading that we do. And so I wanted to think, well, what does reading really look like? What was the movement from the scroll, reading on scrolls, to what we call the codex, this machine here, where you fold pieces of paper in the middle and then you stitch them. What did that allow? Well, that means my book can be a database. My book, it's almost impossible. If I give you a scroll and say, can you find everybody, we're going to be reading from page 97. I say, oh, fucking hell, that's going to take me ages. Whereas if I give you one of these, it doesn't matter if I say page 1 or page 97, you can find it just as quickly. So suddenly, why not have an index? Why not think of a book as a database full of minute morsels of information? A scroll isn't great for being full of minute morsels of information. It's great for reading slowly, for like scrolling down a blog or something. But the transition from scroll to codex allows the book to be a storehouse for morselized information. So I was thinking about that. And so, yes, all of these things, Oulipo, funnily enough, play around. The reason I wrote a book about indexes was because thinking about Oulipo, some of their novels have got indexes. There's an incredible, I really, really recommend, if you read one Oulipo novel, make it Georges Perrec's Life, a User's Manual, which is one of the great, up there with Ulysses, is one of the great sort of novels of the 20th century. But what it does is it tells 100 or 1,000 tiny stories. It feels coherent, but it's just full of little anecdotes that lead on to other, like a couple of pages of small stories, all within a frame, so it doesn't feel like that. And Perec knows this, and so at the end of the novel, Perec has included an index of all the tale of the something, the tale of the frustrated tailor, the tale of the lonely anthropologist and stuff, because he knows that actually this book is a storehouse for backstory, for sort of micro backstory. So I was looking at that thinking, it's a novel with an index, that's funny. And another guy, Harry Matthews, another member, also did a novel with an index, and Italo Calvino has a novel with a table of contents. So before I wrote the book about indexes, I was looking at these Oulipo things, thinking, what is it about these guys that why have we got these novels with indexes? Why don't more novels have indexes? What's the history of indexes? So really that sort of thinking about indexes came from thinking about what guys doing with narrative, the way that you think about narrative as something that's divisible, and thinking about the page as something like, well, if I cut here, suddenly this isn't just a poem, this is 10 to the power of 14 poems.
Anna Garreta wrote a novel called Sphinx, in which the first person never reveals their gender, nor their lover reveals their gender. And you point out that in English this doesn't sound particularly extraordinary, but in French it's equivalent to writing without an E. When I was thinking about this, I was also thinking about the fact that this is, in some sense, a really hard thing to translate.
Yeah.
Because what's at stake here isn't just simply the meaning of the text, it's how it's actually organized. To what extent can Oulipo be translated?
Really good question. Some things at the level of the word. So if you write a novel and you don't allow yourself to use the letter E, that poses really difficult problems for the translator. What happens very often with French Oulipian texts that have been translated into English is you just have to have an Oulipian translator, somebody who goes, well, I can't translate the sense there, but I can play the same game. I can show you what that trick looks like in English. So that the novel we were just talking about there, it's really, because some of this stuff, I've been talking about literature tonight that sounds superficially tricksy, and sometimes it is, but there is great Oulipian work. There's Oulipian work that like Sphinx by Anne Garreta, or Life, a User's Manual, or Bits and Bobs by Raymond Queneau that is great, that is actually as good literature as you could possibly hope for. And Sphinx is a novel from the mid-'80s, but it feels much more contemporary, actually. It's a novel where, in French, the constraint is you don't know whether the first-person narrator is a man or a woman. And the reason this is so hard is because in French, because French is a language, with a gendered language, that's really hard to pull off. If it's in the first person, certain versions of the French past tense, you're going to add an E if it's a woman, or not add an E. You're going to give the game away if you use the passé composé. So you have to use the imperfect tense. Why is she always taking up hobbies and leaving them? Because the imperfect tense, the I did it repeatedly in the past, is a tense where you don't have to give the game away. Adjectives or pronouns, like whose is it, always have to be avoided or played with. So we find sort of fragmentary sentences where it looks like she's going to say it. So it looks like kind of modernist tense with lots of ellipses. I was going to, what was she going to do? Or he going to do? Or are they going to do? We don't know, but because they had to break off the sentence then but it's a novel that just works really well. You don't think, I can see somebody solving a crossword puzzle. I can see somebody like figuring out how to solve a puzzle here. You think this is a wonderful novel. And yet, I suppose your question is, in an English translation, that's not as fun and I think that's true. Okay, so you read the English translation and you don't quite realize how hard it was. You see, okay, here's a novel where I didn't know it was a guy or a woman. You don't think here's a novel where in order to pull this off, it was a real high wire act. And I suppose that's true, but I do recommend reading it even in English because it's just great. It's one of those Oulipian texts that is just worth it. They produce some really, really great literature. But yeah, that thing about translation in general, translating constraints that are at the level of the letter, the only way to do it is to just not translate it, but instead play the game and give us your English version of the game instead.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much for today. It's been really brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Yeah. Great question. Well, so pataphysics the Collège de Pataphysique was founded in the late 40s, 1947, I think, in Paris. And in 47, I think, you might know, Mark, it ran around about 47. So, and it's a sly literary group in Paris, and Raymond Queneau is an important member. His friend Boris Vian are important members. So it's a forum, I think, for people like Queneau to have fun, wry literary discussions. And so when Queneau forms the Oulipo, he has his scientist friends. There are initially 8 of them who've got together and said we should do this thing. And before they have their second meeting, Queneau says, "Oh, actually, can I invite a couple of my friends from the Collège de Pataphysique?" So he invites Noël Arnaud and he invites Latisse. And so it has a affiliation with pataphysics. Initially, they set it up as a subcommittee. They call it a subcommittee of the Collège de Pataphysique. They say that Oulipo is an exploratory committee of the collège. But then the members who weren't originally in the collège, the people who are in Oulipo but not the collège, a couple of years down the line start to think, well, I like this, but I don't like that. I never wanted to be a part of that. And there's a slightly frosty disengagement. So Oulipo becomes its own thing. But it initially, for a couple of years, is run as a sort of subcommittee of the Collège de Pataphysique. And certainly you can see, I mean, I think this is what I get from pataphysics, even now in London pataphysics now. What I enjoy most about it is the doing serious things, talking about literature or trying to think about literature, but trying to think about it in ways that are playful. Trying to do serious things in ways that are playful. So we're talking about Oulipo thinking about, hang on, I don't agree with Freud there. How can I perform my disagreement? Well, maybe I'll perform it by a series of 100 puns or so. So the not having to do serious things seriously, but play not having to be facetious is I think intrinsically pataphysical. And I think that's the thing that Oulipo preserves from pataphysics. The play and seriousness not being mutually distinct. Why can't you have serious play? Why does seriousness have to be boring? Is it fundamentally pataphysical thing? I think. Is that all right? Yeah. Do you recognize that? Yeah.
Yeah. We reproduced all the paintings
from Tony Haney. Yeah.
Quite a whimsical thing to do, but yeah, totally done it. Yeah.
Done whimsical, but done in all earnestness. And who, at any point, I think this is really fun. At any point, if somebody says, "Oh, you're just fucking about," fuck off! How dare you? The earnestness is really important there. Yeah.
Your taxi's coming, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, amazing.
Thank you.
Very much looking forward to your index.
Yeah, for some reason I bought this one online, but it doesn't have an index.
I think that's one of the free.
Yeah. I don't know how I ended up with a freebie copy, but I haven't got an index.
That's beautiful. How did that happen?
So you're breaking for Christmas?
Yeah, but we're going to have a Dada cut to be more fair.
Why don't wait out something?
Yeah, I think she's looking at the front.
No. Okay. Yeah. But it would, for a little while, it would be funny if we said, "Oh, did you enjoy your spinach and ricotta on the seafront suddenly. I'm sorry, I missed the. Is it the same guy again?
Yeah, we have to support that, but in
We're not in the shoot now, holding the team, then we get to come above that. I have to get a couple of ever staying yet, so. Another time, another just God, leaving the jam.